The Stoics said that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. But they never stood at the altar with a man who saw them as currency. In moments of crisis, clarity rarely screams, it whispers. And for Elena Brooks, it had been whispering for months, only now the echo had grown too loud to ignore. At a luxurious coastal wedding, the groom made a spectacle by smashing the wedding cake into the bride's face. He anticipated laughter and a light-hearted moment. But what followed stunned everyone. Subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The splendor of the Harrington estate was unmistakable. Perched on the cliffs of New England's shoreline, with sweeping ocean views and an aura of old aristocracy. The mansion itself stood proud with weathered stone walls, ivy-covered columns, and pristine gardens carved like a green labyrinth. Inside, beneath the glow of vintage crystal chandeliers and the painted eyes of long-deceased ancestors lining the walls, the social event of the year was about to begin. Elena Brooks stood silently before an ornate mirror in the bridal suite. The weight of her wedding gown settled on her like a quiet burden. The dress was stunning, an ivory satin piece with a sculpted bodice and intricate beadwork that sparkled beneath the room's soft amber lighting. It looked like something from a storybook, but Elena knew better than to believe in fairy tales. Her reflection showed a woman composed, her brown skin radiant against the pale fabric, her dark hair perfectly styled. Yet beneath the elegance, something felt wrong. She had sensed it for months now, a silent intuition she had dismissed again and again. This union wasn't born of love. Her fiancé, Julian Harrington, was everything the upper crust of society revered. Tall, polished, Ivy League educated, and most notably, heir to a family legacy that spanned generations. But the Harrington name had lost its power in recent years. Their fortune, once unquestionable, had begun to wither behind a facade of grandeur. Elena's lineage, by contrast, was the face of modern triumph. The Brooks family was built on innovation, tech, venture capital, and bold disruption. Her parents, self-made billionaires, rose from nothing and now commanded reverence across every industry they entered. To them, this marriage was strategic. Her mother painted it as a power alliance, old money meets new influence. Her father, ever the realist, repeated what he always believed. Love fades, a strong partnership lasts. And so, Elena consented. Not because she hated Julian. In the beginning, she was intrigued by him. His confidence, the effortless way he moved through rooms without needing to prove himself. But time revealed the cracks. His charm became tinged with arrogance. He made sly remarks about those unlike himself, never overt, always veiled, but dripping with condescension. He belittled her achievements, labeling her career as a passion project, ignoring that she was one of the youngest, most successful strategic minds in her field. He seemed to believe that marrying her was doing her a favor. Still, she told herself to endure, to adapt, to push through the quiet discomfort, the veiled insults, the shifting tone in his voice that made her feel smaller with each passing day. She had learned to compartmentalize, tuck her misgivings away in a box labeled "necessary sacrifices," and close the lid. But in this room, on this day, under the crushing stillness of the mirror's reflection, the box threatened to burst open. The mask she had so carefully constructed began to fracture at the edges. She had done her best to brush it all aside, to remind herself that in their world, love wasn't a requirement, it was a luxury. She had reminded herself that marriages like theirs were typical. In their world, love wasn't necessary for success. But now, standing alone in that suite with the reality of her decision weighing heavily, Elena wondered if she'd made a mistake. There had been someone once. A man who didn't care about legacy or boardroom politics. He had made her laugh in a way that disarmed her defenses, genuinely, effortlessly. A quiet architect with paint-splattered hands and dreams of designing libraries, not empires. She had loved him in the rare, reckless way that made her believe, just for a moment, that love could survive expectation. But it hadn't. Not when her parents reminded her, gently but firmly, that love didn't build alliances, that he didn't fit. He hadn't fought to stay, and she hadn't fought to keep him. It had ended with a handshake and a goodbye at a train station neither of them mentioned again. She told herself she'd outgrown him. But standing here now, draped in silk and duty, his name returned in a whisper she couldn't shake. A knock at the door startled her. Her mother entered first, graceful as always, wearing a gown only slightly less ornate than Elena's own. Vivian Brooks had a presence that required no effort. Behind her came Elena's father, Robert Brooks, composed and quiet, his sharp gaze measuring his daughter with calm intensity. "You look perfect," Vivian said, adjusting a smooth curl near Elena's temple. "Everything is going exactly as planned." Elena forced a smile. "Of course." Her father stepped forward, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" A question packed with more weight than she could bear. One she wasn't ready to answer. But she nodded anyway. Moments later she descended the grand staircase, every eye turning toward her. Julian stood at the altar, his expression unreadable. He looked refined, as always, tailored tucks, polished shoes, every inch the image of elegance. But when she reached him, when he took her hand, there was no warmth in his touch. The absence of tenderness struck her like a quiet blow, subtle but deep. For a second her fingers stiffened in his. 1,000 thoughts passed through her mind, none of them filled with joy. She had imagined this moment once, the slow walk, the steady breath, the feeling of grounding herself in something real. But what she found instead was hollow space, lined with polite smiles and distant eyes. The ceremony passed in a blur. Vows recited, rings exchanged, polite applause filled the room. Their kiss was brief, staged, devoid of emotion. And just like that, it was over. Mrs. Elena Harrington. The reception unfolded in the Harrington estate's expansive coastal gardens, beneath a canopy of glowing lights. Champagne flowed. Laughter filled the air. Guests moved from table to table, basking in the glamour. Elena played her part flawlessly, smiling, nodding, receiving congratulations with the elegance expected of her. But inside she felt detached, like an observer watching someone else's life unfold. Julian, however, thrived. He moved through the crowd like a seasoned diplomat, shaking hands, weaving through conversations on finance, politics, the global market. He didn't include her. She hadn't expected him to. She wandered toward the estate's stone fountain, briefly alone, when she overheard two older men speaking in hushed tones, colleagues of Julian, likely family friends. "Smart move on his part," one muttered, swirling his whiskey, tying himself to the Brooks fortune. "The girl's got enough capital to keep the Harrington name alive for another century," the other chuckled. "He played it well. She thinks she's getting a husband, but he's cashing in an investment." Elena's fingers tightened around her champagne flute. Her gaze found Julian again. He was laughing at something a friend said, his hand resting too familiarly on the shoulder of an old flame who'd always hovered too close. Maybe she'd known the truth all along. This wasn't love. It wasn't even partnership. It was a transaction. And she was the asset. The words echoed in her skull. Cold, efficient, brutal. Asset. Not woman, not partner, not equal. Her breath caught in her throat, the sting so sharp it felt physical. The realization twisted her stomach. She had always believed she was the one in control, the one setting the terms. But here, in the center of a wedding that should have belonged to her in every way, surrounded by guests who saw her only as a means to an end, she realized the truth. She had never held the power. Not really. Not yet. The Harrington estate shimmered under the weight of expectation and opulence. From the outside, the reception was picture-perfect. Timeless elegance, seamless tradition. Beneath the vast canopy of lights, the elite mingled effortlessly, sipping from crystal flutes, the soft hum of strings adding to the illusion. Elena stood among them, poised, polished, the image of someone who belonged. Yet deep within, something had shifted. Yet beneath her polished exterior, something in Elena had shifted. The businessmen's voices still echoed in her ears, their offhand remarks reducing her to nothing more than a transaction. She wasn't naive. Elena had grown up in a world where money forged alliances, where marriages were bartered like mergers. She had accepted it the day she said yes to Julian. But accepting something in theory was one thing. Living it, seeing herself used in real time, was another entirely. Julian hadn't looked her way since they'd arrived at the reception. He was thriving in this world, sliding effortlessly from one cluster of elites to the next, his performance seamless, like a well-rehearsed actor playing the role of a lifetime. He knew every line, every cue. While she stood as a backdrop to his show, a well-dressed placeholder in the illusion of power and perfection. "Smile, darling." Her mother's voice came softly but firmly beside her. Vivian Brooks shimmered in a deep navy gown that mirrored her commanding presence. Her tone was gentle, but Elena knew it was not a request, it was a directive. People were watching. Elena lifted the corners of her mouth, a motion that felt foreign, strained. Vivian's eyes briefly scanned toward Julian, who now stood by the bar, speaking animatedly with a ring of influential men. "He's working the room. That's good. This is what we expected." That word again, expected. "You should mingle too," Vivian continued smoothly. "There are important people here tonight." Elena's fingers tightened around her champagne flute. Important to who? Her mother's expression remained serene. "To you. To your future." Elena released a slow breath, knowing there was no winning this conversation. Vivian had spent her entire adult life mastering rooms like this, decoding power plays, and reading influence the way others read books. To her, this night wasn't just a celebration, it was a launch, the start of a new legacy. And Elena? She was the chess piece being moved into position. Across the reception, Julian met her gaze. He raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement, a silent toast. A calculated performance for those watching. She returned the gesture without thinking, but her stomach nodded. This was it. What she could expect from him. Gestures. Appearances. A partnership built on paper and strategy. The cracks in his persona were subtle, but now she saw them. She saw it in the way he spoke to her family, the coolness in his tone, the forced charm. When he greeted her father, Robert Brooks, the handshake was firm, but curt. Their words brief. Julian had always been cautious around Robert, though he'd never admit it. There was something about Elena's father, his quiet authority, his unshakable presence, that made Julian uneasy. Perhaps it was because Robert Brooks had built his empire from the ground up, a self-made man who had earned every inch of his influence, while Julian Harrington had merely inherited a name that grew weaker with each passing year. Or maybe it was because Robert saw right through him. "You've done well for yourself," Robert said, his voice calm and neutral. "Your father would be proud." Julian's expression shifted, just for a second. Something unreadable flickered behind his eyes before he covered it with his usual smooth smile. "That means a lot," he replied. But the words rang hollow. Elena watched the exchange closely, noting the slight clench in Julian's jaw before he turned away. She saw it again a moment later, when he spoke to her younger brother, Malcolm. Malcolm had never liked Julian. He had always been courteous, because that was expected. But his politeness never masked the skepticism in his eyes. He regarded Julian the way a watchman might study a fox near the henhouse. "You're an interesting man, Harrington," Malcolm said, swirling his drink slowly. "Not quite who I imagined my sister with." Julian's smile tightened. "And who did you imagine?" Malcolm chuckled, his tone dry. "Someone who knows what he's getting into." The tension was unmistakable. Elena knew her brother well enough to recognize the warning behind his words, and she knew Julian well enough to sense his dislike for being challenged, especially by someone he saw as beneath him. Julian's fingers twitched slightly at his side, the only visible sign of irritation, before he let out a short, composed laugh and excused himself. Elena followed his retreating figure with her eyes as he drained half his drink in one swift motion and handed the empty glass to a passing waiter. He was slipping, and this time she didn't look away. She felt no urge to soften what she saw, no guilt for watching him unravel, thread by thread. This wasn't surprise, it was confirmation. He had always been this man. He had just grown too comfortable hiding it. She had always suspected that his composure was a fragile mask, that beneath the charm lay a temper just waiting for the right crack. She'd caught glimpses of it before, in the sharpness of his voice, in the grip that tightened when something displeased him. But tonight, the cracks were growing, and something inside her told her it wouldn't take much for them to split wide open. The evening dragged on. She played her role, as she always had, smiling, shaking hands, fielding questions about their honeymoon plans, their shared future, their dreams as a newlywed couple. Meanwhile, Julian continued his act, the devoted husband, the ideal son-in-law, the charming heir to a fading dynasty. But she saw him now. She noticed the subtle downturn of his lips when he thought no one was watching, the flicker of annoyance when guests praised her accomplishments over his, the stiffness in his shoulders as the night wore on, like he was holding something back, something simmering just beneath the surface. And then, it all clicked. She hadn't meant to overhear him. She was weaving through the crowd when she caught his voice, low, confident, tinged with smugness. "Smartest move I've ever made," he said. His friends laughed. "You make it sound like a business deal," one of them joked. Julian shrugged. "That's what marriage is." Elena stopped breathing. She turned her head, just enough to see him, to see the way Julian leaned against the bar, calm and confident, the ease in his posture as he spoke about her, like she was nothing more than a strategic acquisition. Her stomach twisted. She had known, hadn't she? Deep down, she'd always known. But hearing it said out loud, so casually, so unapologetically, stripped away any last remnants of illusion she'd clung to. She wasn't a partner in his eyes. She was leverage, a calculated move. And in that moment, something inside her went cold. Not hurt, not shocked, just clarity. A deep, piercing stillness that settled in her chest, colder than the air outside the estate's towering glass doors. He hadn't just used her, he'd diminished her. Publicly, privately, completely. Elena Brooks was not the kind of woman who allowed herself to be used. And if Julian thought this was his triumph, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The air inside the Harrington estate was heavy, with the scent of cologne, fine wine, and the sharp, unspoken tension that had wrapped itself around them. The evening continued with the refined grace expected of such a high society affair. Soft music, choreographed laughter, and the clink of expensive crystal filled the space as toast after toast was raised in their honor. But for Elena, the illusion was unraveling. She had spent the last hour gliding through the reception on autopilot, smiling at guests, accepting compliments, answering shallow questions about honeymoon destinations and long-term plans. Every interaction felt rehearsed. The warmth she once forced into her voice had faded, replaced by a hollow echo of duty. Her cheeks ached from smiling. Her feet hurt. But it was the ache beneath her ribs, the tight coil of fury held tight behind her ribs, that made her feel like she could shatter glass with just a glance. Julian hadn't spoken to her directly since their brief, staged greeting at the entrance. Not once. She had watched him, moving through the crowd like a politician on the campaign trail, his tone smooth, his smile effortless. But she had also seen the subtle tells, the way his mouth tightened ever so slightly when someone mentioned her name, the flicker behind his eyes. He wasn't in control of it, and Elena was beginning to understand something vital about her new husband. Julian Harrington had never intended to share the spotlight. As the evening progressed, that truth became glaringly obvious. Seated now at the head table, surrounded by the most powerful members of both families, the conversation shifted, predictably, toward finances. Elena had expected it. The Brooks name carried weight. New money, yes, but formidable nonetheless. Her family had carved out their empire with intelligence, risk, and relentless drive, dominating in both tech and contemporary art. The Harringtons, by contrast, were a legacy name whose influence was fading with each generation. Julian believed he had played his cards well. He had married the future. But what he didn't understand was that the Brooks family didn't offer their wealth freely. "My wife and I were just saying how beautifully everything came together tonight," one of Julian's uncles commented, swirling his scotch. "A grand event. I can only imagine what it must have cost to pull this off." Elena sensed it before she saw it, the subtle stiffening in Julian's shoulders, the shift in the air around him. She knew exactly what he was waiting for. He was waiting for someone, preferably her father, to confirm what he had always assumed, that the Brooks family had financed this entire event, that tonight's extravagance was yet another generous offering from his new wife's boundless fortune. But Robert Brooks was not a man who operated on assumption. "Well," Robert said evenly, taking a measured sip of his whiskey, "we made sure the financial responsibilities were shared fairly. After all, this is a union of equals." His tone was calm, deliberate, but the words landed like a stone through glass. Elena didn't need to look at Julian to know he was furious. She could feel it, the quiet, simmering anger beneath his flawless exterior. For months, he had convinced himself that marrying her would open the gates to the Brooks family's wealth. That any hardship his family faced would be erased the moment he said, "I do." It wasn't the first time Elena had seen glimpses of this entitlement. There had been signs, small but telling. Comments disguised as jokes about how lucky he was to marry a woman who'd never need to worry about money. More recently, there were the dismissive remarks about her work. The suggestion that someone with her kind of money shouldn't need to work so hard. Julian had never seen her as a partner. He had seen her as an asset, an extension of his ambition, a dowry wrapped in satin and pearls, something to be merged into his ledger. And now, faced with the reality that the Brooks family didn't hand out blank checks, even to family, Elena could feel his fury pulsing beside her. He recovered quickly. "Of course," he said smoothly, his mouth twisting into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A partnership. That was always the intention. But she heard it, the bitterness just beneath the surface. He was livid. The rest of the table moved on, laughter and conversation rising again, but Elena remained hyper-aware of the man beside her. The way his jaw clenched and released, the rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the linen tablecloth. For the first time that night, she felt something unfamiliar. Satisfaction. Once dinner concluded, guests were encouraged to wander through the estate, sampling desserts, visiting the open bar, listening to a smaller orchestra on the balcony under the stars. Elena made her way toward the gardens, needing space. The night air was cool, and the gravel crunched softly beneath her heels. She had only just stepped onto the path when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Julian. He fell into step beside her, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. Then quietly, with a restrained edge in his voice that didn't quite hide the anger beneath, Julian said, "I didn't realize your family was so calculating." Elena inhaled slowly, keeping her expression composed. "Splitting costs fairly. A union of equals," he repeated, letting out a dry, humorless laugh. "That's one way to spin it." She knew what he meant. It wasn't the money that bothered him. It was the symbolism. By refusing to fund the wedding entirely, her family had sent a message. They weren't giving him access. Not to their resources, not to their control. They weren't handing him the keys to the vault. Elena turned, meeting his gaze. The usual charm on his face was gone, replaced by something colder. For all his airs of superiority, Julian Harrington had spent his life believing people like her were beneath him. And yet here he was, depending on her. She saw it in his eyes, the humiliation. And in that instant, there was no doubt in her mind. This wasn't a partnership. This was a power struggle. A quiet war fought with calculated words and veiled digs. And tonight, the first shot had landed. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Julian slipped back into his polished performance, laughing with guests, commanding attention as always. But Elena saw through it now. She saw the tension just beneath the surface, the resentment in his smile. And instead of unease, she felt something else. Power. For the first time since the engagement had been arranged, she held the upper hand. Julian had thought he was marrying into a financial empire. He had thought wrong. And now, he knew it. The atmosphere inside the Harrington estate remained elegant, the illusion of a flawless wedding still intact. For outsiders, nothing had changed. But for those who looked closely, tension lingered in the corners, silent but sharp. Elena moved through the reception with her signature composure, the grace she'd owned over years of high-stakes meetings and society functions. But tonight, her poise wasn't just armor, it was strategy. She watched Julian across the room, his gestures smooth, his voice measured, but his knuckles tightened around his champagne flute when certain subjects came up. Business, financials, future plans. He hadn't said a word to her since their exchange in the garden, and she understood why. He was calculating, assessing his position, plotting his next step. And Elena? She was watching. She knew him now. Julian was the kind of man who had been told his entire life that he was destined for greatness, not because of what he had done, but because of what he had inherited. But tonight, that inheritance had been exposed for what it truly was, a crumbling illusion. And she had seen the look in his eyes the moment he realized she wouldn't be his lifeline. That look was dangerous. The look of a man who felt powerless. And powerless men always searched for a way to take back control. It was during the first dance of the evening that the shift became undeniable. The orchestra played a slow, sweeping melody as the crowd parted for the bride and groom. Elena felt Julian's hand on the small of her back as he guided her onto the floor. Their movements were flawless, perfectly synchronized for the watching eyes, but beneath the practiced grace, she could feel it. The tension. His fingers pressed just a little too firmly against her waist, as if sending her a silent message. "You've been quiet," he murmured, his voice low and controlled. "So have you," she replied, her tone light, unbothered. His lips lifted into what might have passed for a smile, but there was nothing warm in it. The dance continued, each step a silent conversation. Once, Elena had imagined what this moment would feel like. She had hoped that maybe, despite everything, there would be just 1 second of peace. One fleeting illusion of something real, a memory to hold on to. But there was no tenderness in his touch, no softness in the way he moved with her across the polished floor. Only cold calculation and resentment. When the music ended, Elena pulled away with polite grace and excused herself. She needed space, away from the weight of expectations, the pressure of performing. She moved toward the grand staircase, seeking quiet when she heard them. Voices. Male. Low, amused. Carrying from just beyond the arched doorway of the estate's cigar lounge, one of the many private sanctuaries reserved for men in Julian's social circle. She might have walked on. But then she heard her name. "Smartest move I ever made," Julian's voice drawled, just loud enough to chill her to the bone. Laughter followed. Rich, familiar. The kind shared between men who knew exactly what he meant. "You say that like it was hard," one of them teased. "Come on, Harrington, we all saw it. She's the prize of the decade." "She's an investment," Julian corrected smoothly. "The kind that pays off long term." More laughter. Elena felt something inside her go quiet. Not anger, not even betrayal, just clarity. She had known, of course. Some part of her always had. But hearing it, spoken aloud so casually, so openly, and with no trace of guilt, was something else entirely. She should have turned away. Should have let him enjoy his arrogance. Let him believe he had won whatever game he was playing. But she didn't. Instead, she turned and walked directly through the arched doorway. The conversation stopped instantly. Julian, reclining in a high-backed leather chair, looked up. The smirk on his face froze as the air in the room shifted. The other men glanced at each other, unsure whether to excuse themselves or stay. Elena didn't blink. She held his gaze and stepped further into the room. Her expression gave away nothing. "Don't stop on my account," Elena said lightly. It sounded like a fascinating discussion. Julian's fingers tightened slightly around the armrest of his chair. A flicker of something crossed his face, irritation, maybe even panic at being caught. "Elena," he said smoothly, "I was just calling me an investment," she finished for him, her voice calm, even. A beat of silence. One of the men cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Elena took another step forward. It was the first time since the ceremony that she had truly looked at Julian, and now she saw him for exactly what he was. A man who believed he had won. A man who thought that his last name made him untouchable. But she was Elena Brooks. Her power wasn't inherited, it was earned. And Julian Harrington had just made a serious miscalculation. She had entered that room to confront him, but what she found instead was confirmation. He hadn't just embarrassed her, he had exposed himself. And now, under the soft lights and the lingering scent of cigars and power, she felt the scales shift entirely. She was no longer the one who had to prove anything. That burden was gone. She didn't need to say anything more. She had made her point. Turning on her heel, she walked out, leaving only silence behind her, and the weight of it settled like a shadow in the room. By the time she returned to the reception hall, the celebration was in full swing. Guests laughed, danced, toasted, utterly unaware of the fracture that had splintered beneath the surface of the evening. Elena moved gracefully through the crowd, pausing only when she felt a familiar presence beside her, her brother. "You good?" Malcolm asked, his voice low but knowing. She exhaled slowly. "I will be." Her eyes drifted across the room until they landed on Julian. He stood exactly where she expected him to be, surrounded by people who still believed in the polished mask he wore, who still thought he was everything he pretended to be. He hadn't looked at her once since she left the cigar lounge, and she knew why. Because for the first time in his life, Julian Harrington had realized he was not in control. Not anymore. And Elena? She was just getting started. The reception had reached its peak. The laughter louder, the conversations looser, the champagne flowing freely. The air buzzed with festivity as the evening drifted into its final, glittering hours. But beneath the shine of tradition and wealth, Elena felt something shifting, something inevitable, like a storm forming just beyond view. She had watched Julian unravel, felt the cracks in his facade since the moment her father made it clear he would not be Julian's financial lifeline. She had seen the tight grip during their dance, heard the edge in his voice in the garden. And now she could feel it coming, the moment he would lose control. She stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by guests clinking glasses and offering congratulations, waiting for the next choreographed highlight of the evening. The wedding cake, a towering masterpiece in white and gold, had just been wheeled onto the main stage, glowing under the chandeliers. The cake cutting was meant to be a tradition, a symbol of unity, the first act shared by husband and wife. Elena had once imagined this moment differently. But then again, she had imagined a lot of things differently. She made her way toward the cake as the guests turned to watch the couple at the center of the evening. Julian was already there, waiting with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. She saw through it now. He was still furious from their earlier confrontation, still simmering over the fact that she had embarrassed him. First by shutting down his expected access to her family's fortune, and then by exposing him in the cigar lounge for exactly what he was. Julian Harrington was a man who had spent his life believing he was above consequences. Tonight, he'd learned otherwise. Elena stepped beside him, careful not to let their bodies touch. Cameras were aimed at them from every angle, every movement recorded, archived, frozen in time. A silver cake knife was placed into her hand. Julian reached for it, his fingers brushing against hers. The blade between them felt heavier than it should have. Together they made the first cut, clean, effortless. Applause rose around them. Camera flashes lit the room. Then came the part everyone anticipated, the tradition where the couple fed each other the first bite. Elena hesitated only for a breath. She took a small piece, gently balanced it on her fork, and lifted it to Julian's lips. He held her gaze as he accepted it, his jaw tightening just slightly as he chewed. Then it was his turn. She knew what was coming before it happened. Knew it from the size of the piece he cut, from the way his grip tightened ever so subtly. From the flash in his eyes, the rage, the bruised ego, the desperate urge to take back control in any way he could. She saw it, and she didn't move. Some things needed to be seen. In that instant, something inside her stilled, not fear, not confusion, but a quiet surrender to the inevitability of who he truly was. She felt the eyes on her, the lights, the weight of legacy pressing in from every side, and still she chose not to flinch. Let them watch, let them witness. With one swift, deliberate motion, Julian shoved the cake directly into her face. The room fell silent. It was as if time had stopped. Thick, sugary frosting smeared across Elena's face, coating her cheek, her lips, her lashes. The cream dripped down, staining the lace of her gown. A few nervous chuckles broke out, uncertain. Was this part of the show? But Elena didn't laugh. She didn't speak, didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch, letting the full weight of what he had just done hang in the air. Julian had expected laughter, expected her to smile and wipe it away, to play along, to keep up the illusion. But Elena Brooks wasn't the kind of woman who played the fool. And tonight, Julian Harrington had gone too far. The whispers began almost immediately, sharp, hushed, like the sound of silk rustling in a quiet room. Did that just happen? He threw it right in her face. That wasn't playful. That was... The clink of a glass being set down abruptly cut through the murmurs. Out of the corner of her eye, Elena saw her father rise to his feet. She saw her mother press a firm hand against her father's arm, stopping him before he could take a single step. Not yet. Not here. Elena inhaled slowly, reaching for a napkin that had been left on the edge of the table. With calm, deliberate motion, she wiped the frosting from her cheek. Her fingers were steady, her expression unmoved. She met Julian's gaze, and for the first time that night she saw something unfamiliar in his eyes. Doubt, uncertainty, a flicker of realization that maybe, just maybe, he had miscalculated. She let the silence linger just a few seconds longer, long enough for everyone in the room to feel it settle over them like a veil. Then, with quiet, devastating finality, she turned on her heel and walked away. The reception never truly recovered. People tried, of course. The band resumed playing. Servers continued pouring drinks. Guests attempted to smile, to refocus their conversations, to recapture the illusion. But the energy had shifted. The facade had cracked. Elena didn't return to the ballroom. Instead, she climbed the staircase to the private bridal suite, each step shedding the performance she had carried all night. Behind the door, she peeled the soiled fabric of her wedding gown from her body, feeling the weight of the evening press into her bones. She stood in front of the mirror. What stared back was a woman covered in the remnants of a celebration that had never really belonged to her. A woman who had tried, naively, to believe she could shape this marriage into something that served her on her terms. She should have known better. There was nothing to salvage. She had given Julian every opportunity to prove himself worthy of her trust. And he had done the opposite, openly, shamelessly, irreversibly. A knock came at the door. She didn't have to ask who it was. Her mother entered first, composed, but with a sharpness in her eyes Elena had only seen when something truly unforgivable had occurred. Her father followed, his entire posture coiled with restrained fury. "Darling," Vivian said gently, "you don't have to make any decisions tonight." But Elena already had. She met her mother's gaze through the mirror. "This is over." And for the first time that evening, she felt something close to relief. Because she had been waiting, whether she knew it or not, for a reason. And now she had one. The final, irrefutable proof that she would never, could never, spend her life with someone like Julian Harrington. She had once believed she could outplay him, that she could bend the rules of this marriage, maneuver the pieces to secure her power. But power meant nothing if she allowed herself to be humiliated, and Elena Brooks belonged to no one. By the end of the night, Julian would understand that. And by morning, so would the rest of the world. They would all know it too. The weight of the frosting still clung to Elena's skin, even after most of it had been wiped away. Her gown, once flawless, now bore the stains of the public humiliation she had endured in front of hundreds of witnesses. She had always been composed, always in control. But this was different. This wasn't an accident. It was a line crossed. A statement from Julian that she wasn't his equal, but his possession. Something to be put in place the moment she dared to challenge him. The room was still buzzing with uneasy conversation as she walked away. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step precise, each movement a quiet act of rebellion. Guests whispered in hushed, frantic tones, unsure whether to laugh off what had just happened or acknowledge its undeniable weight. Some had already begun gathering their things, their faces tight with discomfort, aware that they had just witnessed the unraveling of something far more serious than a misstep in tradition. Behind her, Julian remained standing beside the cake. The smirk that had lingered on his face faltered, slipping into something closer to confusion, maybe even fear. As the silence around him grew deafening, he had expected a performance, expected her to giggle, to play along, to brush it off, and let the evening continue, to absorb the blow with grace so he could retain control. But Elena had done none of that. She hadn't screamed, hadn't thrown the cake back at him, hadn't created a scene. She had simply walked away, and in doing so, let her silence speak louder than any outburst ever could. Each step up the stairs felt like resistance incarnate, refusing to collapse, refusing to entertain the spectacle. She didn't need to shout to burn the moment into the memory of every person watching. Her silence was a fire in its own right. She passed waiters frozen mid-step, guests who averted their eyes, family who watched with thinly veiled fury. Vivian and Robert Brooks stood nearby, their expressions unreadable, but their presence unshakable. Elena caught the tension in her father's posture, the way his hands curled tightly into fists. The rage barely contained. If her mother hadn't placed a firm hand on his arm, Robert would have crossed the room by now and ensured Julian regretted every decision that led to this moment. Malcolm was the first to move. Her brother had been sitting close by, and the second Elena turned away from Julian, Malcolm rose, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable, save for the fire in his eyes. Elena didn't speak as she passed him, and he didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't need to. He already knew the answer. The staircase leading to the bridal suite felt longer now. She ascended it with measured grace, fully aware that every eye in the room was still trained on her. That every guest was waiting for the next scene. The drama, the spectacle, the story they could retell at future dinners. But she gave them none of it. The doors to the suite closed behind her with a finality that felt like the end of a chapter. The room was untouched, silent. Below her, the chaos continued. The laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses from the reception hall now muffled and distant, as if they belonged to a different world entirely. Elena crossed the suite with purpose, moving toward the vanity. A silver-framed mirror stared back at her, reflecting a version of herself she barely recognized. The woman in white was no longer a bride. She was something else entirely. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the vanity, steadying herself, not from fear, not from sadness, but from the sheer force of everything she was holding back. The weight of what had led her here, the months of second-guessing, the quiet humiliations, the hollow justifications, the belief that she could manage this marriage, manipulate its terms to fit her strength. She had been wrong. A knock at the door pulled her from the storm inside her head. She didn't respond. The door opened anyway. Vivian entered first, her movement fluid as always, her gown shimmering under the soft, sweet lighting. Her face was composed, but her eyes burned with quiet fury. Robert followed behind her, closing the door with a definitive click. His presence filled the room with restrained intensity. No one spoke at first. It was Vivian who broke the silence. "You don't have to go back down there." Elena met her mother's gaze in the mirror. Not just concern, but something deeper. This wasn't just about cake. This was about every warning ignored, every decision made under the illusion of control, every compromise that led to this night. Robert exhaled sharply, pacing near the window, dragging a hand across his jaw as if trying to contain his anger. Elena had seen her father angry before, but never like this. Not so still, not so lethal. She turned to face them fully. "It's over." Vivian didn't flinch. Robert stopped pacing. Her mother tilted her head ever so slightly, studying Elena's expression, for doubt, for fear, for any sign she might hesitate. She found none. "Good," Robert said, his voice like steel, "because if you weren't walking away from this, I would have dragged you out myself." Elena let out a breath. The tension in her shoulders loosened just slightly. Vivian stepped forward, taking her hands in her own, gently squeezing. "You don't have to make a statement tonight," she said quietly, "but tomorrow when the world wakes up, they need to know exactly where you stand." And they would. There would be no carefully crafted press release, no softened explanations. Elena Brooks would not be the woman who stayed. She would not be the wife who tolerated disrespect. She would be the woman who walked away. The knock at the door came again, sharper this time, more urgent. Robert opened it before Elena could respond, revealing Malcolm on the other side. His expression was dark. "He's coming up here." The room tensed. Vivian let out a soft, weary sigh, as though she had expected this, but had hoped for more time. Robert's jaw tightened. Elena didn't need to ask who he meant. Of course, Julian would come, because that's what men like him did. They crossed lines, tested limits, demanded explanations when things didn't go their way. And tonight, he was about to learn that Elena was done giving him any. She straightened her shoulders, smoothing the stained fabric of her gown where the remnants of cake still clung. Then, with the same composed poise her mother had modeled all her life, she turned toward the door. "Let him in." Malcolm hesitated. Her father tensed. But Elena had already made her decision. If Julian thought this night wasn't over yet, he was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. Because this wasn't just about what had happened downstairs. This was about power. And tonight, for the first time in his life, Julian Harrington was about to understand what it felt like to lose it. She took a breath, measured, grounded, and let it settle into her spine. This wasn't fear. This was preparation. A final reckoning dressed in silk and silence. The room behind her, once filled with laughter and plans, now felt like a courtroom. And she, for the first time, wasn't the defendant. She was the judge. The door opened before Julian could knock. He paused for just a fraction of a second before stepping into the bridal suite. His polished shoes sank into the plush carpet. The room smelled faintly of vanilla and orchids, a stark contrast to the heavy scent of whiskey and cigars that still clung to him. His eyes moved quickly over the room, taking it all in. Elena standing in the center, her gown still streaked with frosting, her expression unreadable. Vivian stood to her right, silent, commanding. Robert stood near the door, a quiet wall between Julian and the exit, and Malcolm leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, gaze steady. Julian had always known how to control a room, but this was not his room. He had come expecting anger, maybe even tears. Instead, he was met with something far worse. Silence. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "I came to talk." Elena didn't move, didn't blink. She simply stood there, still, unshaken. The silence stretched, thick and immovable. Julian had expected a confrontation, something he could twist and use. But she gave him nothing, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "Are you really going to do this?" he asked, his voice low but sharp in the stillness. "Walk away from this marriage over a joke?" Still, she said nothing. His jaw tightened, composure slipping. "This is ridiculous, Elena. It was just a bit of cake. I was playing along with tradition." Her voice, when it came, was cold and clear. No one laughed. It was the first thing she had said to him since walking away. And it cut. Julian's nostrils flared, his frustration rising. "So that's it? You're going to humiliate me in front of everyone? Make a scene over nothing?" Robert shifted slightly, a silent warning. But Elena didn't need protection. She had already won. She had won the moment she refused to engage, the moment she withheld the reaction he had been counting on. Finally, Elena moved, just a step closer, tilting her head ever so slightly as she looked at him. There was something in her eyes that resembled pity. "This was never going to work," she said softly, and the certainty in her voice made something in Julian shift, tighten in a way he wasn't used to. He had expected to be in control, to set the terms, to make the decisions. He had never expected to lose. Yet here he was, standing in front of a woman who had already made up her mind. He let out a sharp breath, his mask slipping for the briefest of moments before he forced a smirk back onto his face. "So what now? You think you can just walk away?" "The world doesn't work like that, Elena. People don't get to rewrite the rules just because they don't like how they're playing out." She smiled then. But it wasn't a smile he recognized. It wasn't warm. It wasn't soft. It wasn't meant to soothe. It was a smile of certainty, of quiet, resolute power. "I already have." And that was it. That was the end. Julian stood there a second longer, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to step in and say it wasn't real, that she was bluffing, that she would come around. But no one did, because everyone in that room already knew the truth. Elena Brooks was done. He turned and walked out without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed swallowed the space he had left behind. Vivian exhaled slowly, her eyes unreadable. Robert gave a single nod, as though affirming what he had always suspected. Malcolm smirked faintly, unsurprised that Julian hadn't fought harder. And Elena? She felt the tension drain from her shoulders. It was over, and for the first time in months, maybe even years, she felt free. The sound of the door closing behind Julian echoed with finality. Elena stood in the center of the suite, the weight of the night pressing on her, but not in the way she had expected. She had imagined this moment before, long before walking down the aisle. Before letting herself believe she could manage a man like him, she had envisioned breaking free, but she hadn't expected it to be this fast, this clean, this complete. And yet, as the silence stretched, she had no doubt. Her mother was the first to move, stepping toward her with that same poised grace she had carried her entire life. Vivian Brooks had never needed to raise her voice. She never needed to. Impulsively, but with the calm of someone who had been waiting all night, Vivian stepped forward. She had been watching Elena closely. Knowing this moment would come, she reached out, brushing a straight strand of hair from her daughter's face. Her fingers passed gently over the remnants of frosting still clinging to Elena's skin. "We'll take care of everything," Vivian said, her voice smooth, assured. There was no hesitation in her tone, no question about what came next, because she had always known how this would end. She had seen it long before Elena had been willing to admit it. Robert remained by the door, hands still tucked in his pockets, expression unreadable. But Elena knew him well enough to see the depth of the fury he kept contained. He had restrained himself tonight, held back from doing what every instinct had told him to do. If Julian had been anyone else, if they had been anywhere else, There would have been no discussion, no private confrontation. Robert would have handled things in a way that left no room for negotiation. But this wasn't about rage. This was about something far greater than a moment of anger. Elena took a breath, slow and steady, feeling exhaustion settle into her bones. "I want it done by morning," she said simply. Vivian's lips twitched, the closest she ever came to smiling. "Of course." From where he leaned against the far wall, Malcolm let out a quiet laugh, arms still crossed. "Julian's going to wake up tomorrow and realize his entire life fell apart while he was sleeping." Elena met her brother's gaze. "That's the least he deserves." She turned toward the mirror once more, facing the fractured reflection of herself shaped by the events of the night. She had entered this marriage thinking she could work within the rules, that she could shape the terms to suit her, mold the situation into something manageable. But control had never really been hers. Julian had believed he held the power, believed she would be like so many others before her, silent, accommodating, willing to endure humiliation for the sake of appearances. He had thought he could diminish her, that he could force her into submission. He had never been more wrong. She stepped away from the mirror and turned to her father. "Make the calls." Robert nodded once. "It's already being handled." Elena understood what that meant. He hadn't waited for her to decide. The moment she had walked away from the cake table, the moment her silence spoke louder than any outburst, he had begun putting things in motion. Vivian had always been the face of the Brooks family, but Robert had been its force. And by the time Julian Harrington even realized what was happening, it would already be done. It would be too late. Elena moved to the wardrobe in the far corner of the suite, pulling open the doors. Inside hung the carefully selected outfits she had packed for a honeymoon that would never happen, designer pieces curated for a life she would no longer be living. Without hesitation, she slipped out of the ruined gown, letting it fall into a heap of silk and lace on the floor. She reached for something else, something simple, comfortable, an outfit that belonged to her, not to the illusion of the woman she had been expected to become. As the dress hit the floor, the sound was soft, barely a whisper, but it felt monumental, like closing a vault, like stepping out of a costume after the final curtain call. The cool air brushed against her skin, and for the first time in days, she could breathe. She dressed quickly, each movement precise and unflinching. Her mother watched in silence, though Elena could feel the quiet approval in her presence. When she finished, she turned to face them. "I want to be gone before he realizes." Robert checked his watch. "We've got an hour, maybe less." That was enough. She didn't need to see the aftermath. She didn't need to watch Julian come to terms with the reality that the empire he had imagined building had collapsed in a single night. By the time he opened his eyes in the morning, the damage would already be done. The announcement would be public. The marriage, over before it had truly begun. His business connections, already shaky, would dissolve completely. His name, once spoken with respect, would now be tied to scandal, to failure, to a man who had lost everything in the span of a single evening. There would be no coming back from this. Elena knew Julian would try. He would fight. He would rage. He would scramble to regain control in whatever way he could. But it wouldn't matter. He had underestimated her. And no one survived that mistake twice. She walked toward the door. Her mother and brother followed closely behind. Robert was already on the phone, his voice low and steady as he finalized the details. Elena didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. As they stepped into the elevator, Vivian finally spoke again. "Where do you want to go?" Elena considered the question for only a moment before exhaling. "Anywhere but here." Vivian nodded. "Then that's where we'll go." And as the elevator descended, carrying her away from everything that had gone wrong, Elena felt the weight she'd been dragging for months start to lift. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to remember who she was before this night. Enough to know she would never be that woman again. As the elevator doors slid shut, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Freedom. Dear friend, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from the life you thought you had to live. Like Elena, many of us find ourselves wrapped in expectations, stitched into roles that never quite fit. But the Stoics remind us, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Elena's story isn't just about escape. It's about returning to herself. And maybe like her, you're standing at the edge of a decision, holding your breath in a place that no longer feels like home. If so, remember, it's never too late to choose peace over performance, truth over illusion. The door to freedom is often quieter than we expect, but once it opens, the air is different. You owe it to yourself to feel that air. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us reach more hearts like yours and tell more stories that matter.